Hello biology students, and welcome to video 4 of the organic chemistry unit. So in this video we're going to continue our discussion of lipids. So remember in video 3 we had talked about triglycerides, which were the first type of lipids, and in this video we're going to look at the other 3 types: steroids, phospholipids, and waxes. Okay, so first, starting with steroids. So the main structure of a steroid is 4 fused carbon rings. So for example, here I have a ring. It kind of looks like a monosaccharide. And remember, at each vertex, there's carbon, with the appropriate amount of hydrogens on it. And if we have a steroid, what we actually have is 4 rings that are fused together. So maybe a steroid might look something like that. I have 4 rings that are fused together. Now, technically, steroids are not considered to be a polymer because they're not made up of individual monomers. A steroid is always just 4 fused rings. You can't take one ring away or add an extra ring and still have a steroid. So they're technically not a polymer. The most famous example of a steroid is cholesterol. Cholesterol is all throughout your body, and it's very important for regular everyday functionings of your cells. It's one of the main components of cell membranes. We're going to see that a little bit next unit. And it's also the base for every other steroids. So all the other steroids in your body, so if you're a male, things like testosterone, or if you're a female, so things like progesterone and estrogen, are all made from cholesterol. Cholesterol is turned into those other steroids, into those hormones, by various reactions in your body. So because of these reasons, and because of lots of other reasons, cholesterol, despite its bad rap that it's gotten in the health industry, is actually very essential for proper cell function. So here are some pictures of some steroids. So here we can see cholesterol. We can see these four rings that are fused together. And then there's various functional groups and chains that are sticking off the 4 rings. Estradiol is a precursor, or the molecule that turns into estrogen, which is a main female hormone. And testosterone here is another steroid, and testosterone is the main male sex hormone. Okay, so I know when you hear the word steroids, what you probably think of is those things that professional athletes sometimes illegally inject to make themselves stronger. So when you think of these kind of steroids, what you're actually thinking of are anabolic steroids. So anabolic steroids are usually synthetic testosterone. So synthetic means made in the lab. So this is a version of testosterone that has been chemically created. And people sometimes inject this because what this hormone does is it increases protein synthesis. So that box is supposed to be an up arrow. For some reason, this program never translates boxes correctly. It also gives you more muscle tissue, and therefore it gives you more muscle. Unfortunately, this comes with a lot of downsides. It can be very unhealthy for you. It can cause rage, and overall it can be very unhealthy for your body. So you might ask, well, why were these steroids ever made in the lab in the first place if they're so bad for you? Well, they actually do have some therapeutic use. They can be used to treat diseases where you often have muscle that's wasting away, so things like HIV and some cancers. But as I'm sure you know, they've been largely misused to give professional athletes a competitive edge. Okay, so the next type of lipid we're going to talk about is the phospholipid, and this one is super important. This one's going to come back a lot in future units. So the basic structure of a phospholipid, this should look very familiar to you because phospholipids look a lot like triglycerides. So you can see, just like a triglyceride, they have a glycerol molecule right there. Just like triglycerides, they have 2 fatty acids. You can see here I have a saturated fatty acid, here I have an unsaturated fatty acid. And for phospholipids, it doesn't matter if they're saturated or unsaturated. They just have 2 fatty acids, a glycerol. However, where a triglyceride would have a 3rd fatty acid right here, instead, what a phospholipid has is a phosphate group. So you can see what I've circled in red there, that's the phosphate group. And it's called the phosphate group because it has a phosphate molecule, amongst other things. So obviously, you might see it drawn like this, but more often than not, you'll see it drawn as something like this, where this circle right here represents the phosphate group and the glycerol, okay? And then the 2 fatty acid tails are down here. So I want you to notice a couple things. This head region, the glycerol and the phosphate group are hydrophilic. They're water-loving. That end of the molecule is polar, so it will mix well with water. And then the two fatty acid tails, we already know that from the triglycerides that those are hydrophobic. They are nonpolar, so that half of the molecule does not mix well with water. So we have a little interesting conundrum here where half the molecule is polar and half of it is nonpolar, which gives it some really useful properties. So phospholipids. So this is just kind of a written down version of what I just told you. So we know that triglycerides that we saw in the last video are made of one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. Phospholipids are very similar. They're made of one glycerol, 2 fatty acids, but that third fatty acid has been replaced by a phosphate group. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to this picture over here. So it turns out that phospholipids are actually the main component of cell membranes. We said on the other page, on the other slide, that cholesterol is also found in cell membranes, but phospholipids are the main component. And the reason that they're the main component of cell membranes has to do with the fact that they are half polar, half hydrophilic, and half nonpolar, half hydrophobic. Okay, so you can imagine, here's a cell, and this line is supposed to represent my cell membrane. I know I have water, we have water inside of our cells and water outside of our cells. So if you look, if I put a little box right here, that picture down below is supposed to be a blown up section of that. So here I'm looking at a cross section of the membrane. So you can see here is the water outside the cell and here's the water inside the cell. So you can see I have a double layer of phospholipids that makes up the cell membrane. And in each case, the hydrophilic heads, the water-loving heads, are pointing out towards the water. And then the nonpolar section, the section that is not like water, is pointing inwards. And this is very useful because the heads are pointing outwards, they can interact with the water inside and outside of the cell, but because it's inside of this membrane, the inside of the double layer of phospholipids is nonpolar, it helps to create a barrier so things have a harder time getting in and out of the cell. And we're going to look at that a lot more later. Okay, so finally, you might have noticed that we didn't talk about waxes. Waxes are the 4th category of lipids, but we don't have much to say about them right now. So just know for now that waxes are a type of lipid, but we're not going to look at them in this unit. So finally, to close out our talk of lipids, I want to talk a little bit about heart disease, because heart disease and lipids are very related. So a normal, happy artery, so arteries are some of the vessels that carry blood in our body. Normally, they're very elastic, they're very bendable, and they are not clogged. And this helps keep blood flowing nice and smoothly. But if you eat a diet that's very, very high in cholesterol, so cholesterol we know is good, but too much of anything is a bad thing. So too much cholesterol or too many saturated fats, what happens is you get solid plaque or buildup to build up in your arteries. So remember we said that saturated fats are solid at room temperature. So if too much of them clump together, you get what's called plaque in your arteries. So you can kind of imagine if I have an artery and blood's flowing happily through it, and I get a buildup of plaque, there'll be less room for the blood to flow through, and that could be a problem. So this is called arteriosclerosis, when there's reduced space for your blood to flow. Ooh, these boxes again. Okay, so these boxes are supposed to be arrows. This program has a really hard time drawing arrows when I want it to. Basically what happens, if I get this plaque to build up, what happens is platelets, which are some cell fragments in your blood, can get stuck on this plaque, and that could eventually cause a blood clot, which is called a thrombosis. That's a vocab word for you. And that blood clot will stop blood circulating altogether. Now, if this happens in the arteries that lead to your heart muscle, you're no longer getting any blood to go to your heart, and that's a heart attack because the cells in your heart are not getting enough oxygen and nutrients to keep on pumping. If you happen to get a thrombosis in the vessels, the arteries that lead to your brain, that's when you get a stroke because your brain is not getting enough oxygen and nutrients from your blood. So here's a picture to explain to you what I just drew. So you can see a normal artery is nice and open, but if we get plaque buildup from too much saturated fat and cholesterol, you have less room for the blood, and that's when you can get a blood clot, when platelets, components in your blood get stuck on that plaque. And that can lead to a heart attack or a stroke. So that's it for video 4. I'll see you in video 5 where we'll start talking about proteins.